Foundations of Western Political Thought. Module 1, The Greek Achievement, Plato and Aristotle. In 399 BC, the city of Athens executed a 70-year-old man for corrupting the youth and failing to honor the city's gods. They gave him hemlock to drink. He spent his final hours with his friends, discussing the immortality of the soul, and then drank the poison calmly, chiding his companions for weeping. His name was Socrates, and his death is where Western philosophy truly begins. Socrates himself wrote nothing. Everything we know about him comes from others, primarily his student Plato, and Plato was so shattered by his teacher's execution that he devoted his life to a single question. How could the best man he had ever known be condemned to death by a democracy? What was wrong with Athens? And what would a truly just city look like? That question animates almost everything Plato wrote, and his answers, controversial, brilliant, sometimes disturbing, set the terms for 25 centuries of political philosophy. Our path through the Greek achievement runs thus: the trial that shattered Plato, and the cave that became his answers, the forms that exist beyond appearances, and the philosopher-king who alone can perceive them. Then Aristotle, who looked at the same questions and saw differently, who brought the forms down to earth, made virtue a matter of habit rather than theory, and declared that man is by nature a political animal. By the end, you will understand why we still argue in their vocabulary, and why their disagreement about how to think about politics has never been resolved. The trial of Socrates. To understand Plato, you need to understand what happened to Socrates and why it mattered. Socrates was not a conventional philosopher. He had no school, wrote no books, charged no fees. He simply walked around Athens, asking questions. Important men, politicians, poets, generals, would find themselves cornered by this stonemason's son, interrogated about things they thought they understood. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? And under questioning, their confident answers would fall apart. This made Socrates famous and unpopular in roughly equal measures. Young men flocked to watch him humiliate their elders. The elders did not appreciate it. Athens, in 399 BC, was a wounded city. It had lost a catastrophic war against Sparta just 5 years earlier. It had suffered a brutal oligarchic coup, the 30 tyrants, who had killed hundreds of citizens before democracy was restored. People were looking for someone to blame, and Socrates made an easy target. 2 of his former associates, Critias and Alcibiades, had been among the worst traitors and tyrants. Surely the man who taught them bore some responsibility. The charges were vague: corrupting the youth, introducing new gods, failing to honor the old ones. The real grievance was that Socrates made powerful people look foolish, and that his students had helped destroy the city. The jury voted to convict, and when Socrates refused to grovel or propose a serious alternative punishment, they voted for death. Plato was there. He was about 28 years old. He watched the democracy he had grown up in kill the man he most admired, not through tyrannical caprice, but through proper legal procedure, by majority votes. And he drew a devastating conclusion: the many are not fit to rule. The crowd that condemned Socrates was not evil. They were ignorant. They did not know what justice was, what goodness was, what they were doing. And ignorance with power is lethal. The cave. This brings us to the most famous image in all of philosophy, Plato's allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in an underground cave since childhood. They face a wall and cannot turn around. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners people walk back and forth carrying objects, statues, figures of animals, tools. The prisoners see only the shadows of these objects cast on the wall. They hear only echoes. The shadows are their entire realities. They give the shadows names, develop expertise in predicting which shadow will appear next, and compete for honors based on this expertise. Now imagine one prisoner is free. He turns around and sees the fire. It blinds him, causes pain. He is dragged up a steep passage toward the mouth of the cave. The sunlight is agonizing. Only gradually can he bear to look at real objects, then at reflections in water, then at the stars and moon, and finally at the sun itself, the source of all light and visibility. What would happen if he went back down? His eyes, adjusted to sunlight, would be useless in the darkness. He would stumble, appear foolish. The other prisoners would conclude that the journey had ruined him, and if he tried to free them, to tell them their shadow expertise was worthless, that everything they valued was illusion, they might well kill him. Plato is not being subtle. The prisoners are ordinary people. The shadows are the world of appearances, the opinions, conventions, and seeming truths that most people take for realities. The journey upward is philosophical education. The sun is the form of the good, the ultimate truth that makes everything else intelligible. And the philosopher who returns to the cave to help others is Socrates killed for his trouble by people who preferred their shadows. The forms. To understand the cave, you need to understand what Plato meant by the forms, and this is where things get metaphysically strange. Look around you. You see many different chairs. They differ in size, color, material, designs. Yet you recognize them all as chairs. How? Plato's answer, there is a form of chair, chairness itself, that exists independently of any particular chairs. The physical chairs you see participate in this form are imperfect copies of it. The form is eternal, unchanging, perfect. The physical chairs are temporary, changing, flawed. Now extend this to everything. There is a form of justice, perfect and eternal, which the just actions we observe imperfectly imitate. A form of beauty, that beautiful things approximate but never fully achieve. A form of the good, that is the source and standard for all goodness. This sounds bizarre to modern ears, and philosophers have been arguing about what Plato really meant for millennia. But the basic intuition is not crazy. When we say an action is unjust, we seem to be measuring it against some standards. When we say one thing is more beautiful than another, we imply a scale with something at the top. Plato took this seriously. The standards are real, more real than the things measured against them. The forms matter politically because they mean there are right answers. Justice is not merely whatever a particular city happens to call just. It is a real thing, existing independently of human opinion, which our laws and institutions either approximate or fail to approximate. The question is not, what do people think justice is, but what is justice really? And most people, trapped in the cave, have no idea. The philosopher king. This leads to Plato's most notorious political proposal, the philosopher king. If most people are prisoners in a cave, mistaking shadows for reality, they cannot be trusted to govern. Democracy is ruled by the ignorant. Oligarchy is ruled by the wealthy, whose money gives them no special insight into justice. Tyranny is ruled by appetite, the worst of all. What is needed is ruled by those who have made the journey out of the cave, who have seen the form of the good and can therefore judge correctly what is truly best for the city. These are the philosophers, not philosophers in our sense, academics writing papers for other academics, but lovers of wisdom who have disciplined their souls through decades of mathematical and dialectical training until they can perceive eternal truth. In Plato's ideal city described in the Republic, these philosophers would rule, reluctantly, because having seen true beauty and goodness, They would rather contemplate it than return to the cave of politics. But they would rule, because only they know what is genuinely good for the city, as opposed to what merely appears good to the ignorant majority. This is breathtakingly anti-democratic. Plato knew it. He had watched democracy kill Socrates. He had seen the Athenian assembly make catastrophic decisions, launching the disastrous Sicilian expedition on a whim, executing successful generals for failing to rescue drowning sailors during a storm. He concluded that asking the ignorant to vote on matters they do not understand is like asking passengers to vote on navigation, while the one person who can read the stars is ignored. There is something to this. We do not let passengers vote on whether to trust the pilot's instruments. We do not let patients vote on their diagnosis. Why should we let citizens vote on matters of justice and policy if they have not studied what justice is? But there is also something terrifying about it. Who decides who the philosophers are? Plato's guardians would control education, art, family life, breeding humans like livestock, censoring poetry, lying to the citizens for their own goods. The Republic is not a blueprint for paradise. Read closely. It is a warning about what happens when the desire for perfect justice overrides every other consideration. Whether Plato intended it as a serious proposal or as a thought experiment that reveals the costs of pursuing perfect justice remains debated. What matters for us is the question he forces. If there are right answers about how to live, and most people do not know them, what follows for politics? The allegory of the ship. Plato offered another image that clarifies his anti-democratic argument. The allegory of the ship. Imagine a ship at sea. The shipowner is larger and stronger than the crew, but somewhat deaf, somewhat short-sighted, and his knowledge of navigation is equally limited. The sailors quarrel about steering, each thinking he ought to steer, though none has ever learned the art. They claim navigation cannot be taught. Anyone who says otherwise they are ready to cut to pieces. They crowd around the shipowner, begging and scheming for him to hand over the helms. If they cannot persuade him, they kill those who can, and drug the shipowner himself. Then they take control, make free with the stores, and turn the voyage into a drunken pleasure cruise. Meanwhile, the true navigator, who must study the seasons, the sky, the stars, the winds, they call a useless stargazer. They do not understand that he must master these things if he is really to control a ship. The application is obvious. The shipowner is the people, strong but ignorant. The quarreling sailors are the politicians, competing for power without knowledge, flattering the public, making promises they cannot keep. The true navigator is the philosopher, despised, called useless, but the only one who actually knows how to reach port safely. Now ask yourself, is Plato wrong? We would never vote on how to fly an aeroplane. We would not ask passengers to decide on medical treatment by majority rules. Why do we think voting is appropriate for questions of justice, policy, and the common good, questions arguably harder than navigation or medicine? Plato's challenge is not easily dismissed. The Democrat must either argue that there are no right answers in politics, that it is all mere preference, or that ordinary people can somehow reach good answers despite lacking specialized knowledge. Neither response is obviously correct. The soul and the city. One more aspect of the Republic deserves attention. Plato draws an elaborate parallel between the soul and the city. The soul, he argues, has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetites. Reason seeks truth and wisdom. Spirit, the spirited part, source of anger and honor, seeks victory and recognitions. Appetite seeks pleasure, food, drink, sex, money. A healthy soul is one where reason rules, spirit supports reason's decisions, and appetite is kept in proper bounds. An unhealthy soul is one where appetite dominates, dragging reason and spirit along in pursuit of endless pleasures, or where spirit rules, caring only for honor and victory regardless of what is truly good. The city mirrors this structure. Rulers correspond to reason. They should be those who love wisdom and can perceive the goods. Guardians correspond to spirit auxiliaries who enforce the ruler's decisions and defend the city with courage and loyalty. Producers correspond to appetite, farmers, craftsmen, merchants who provide for material needs. A just city is one where each part does its proper works. Rulers rule, guardians guard, producers produce, and none meddles in the business of the others. Injustice is precisely this meddling, when producers try to rule, or guardians pursue wealth, or rulers care only for honor. This is Plato's definition of justice, both in soul and cities. Justice is not primarily about how we treat others. It is about proper internal order, each part performing its function and not overstepping. The implications are severe. Most of us have disordered souls, ruled by appetite or spirit rather than reasons. Most cities are disordered for the same reason, ruled by the wealthy or the ambitious or the crowd rather than by those who actually know what is good. The just city requires the just soul, and both are rare. Enter Aristotle. Aristotle came to Plato's academy at 17 and stayed for 20 years. He was from Stagira in northern Greece, not an Athenian citizen, always somewhat an outsider. His father had been physician to the king of Macedon, which gave Aristotle connections that would later prove significant. When Plato died, Aristotle was passed over to lead the academies. He left Athens, eventually becoming tutor to a 13-year-old Macedonian prince. That prince would become Alexander the Great, which means Aristotle had a direct hand in educating the man who would conquer most of the known worlds. When Alexander set off on his campaigns, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. The contrast with Plato is instructive. Plato founded an academy focused on mathematics and abstract dialectics. Aristotle's Lyceum was more like a research institute. He and his students collected constitutions, reportedly 158 of them, studying how different cities actually organized themselves. They catalogued animals, plants, everything they could observe. Where Plato looked upward to eternal forms, Aristotle looked around at the messy particulars of the world. This difference in temperament shapes everything. The critique of the forms. Aristotle respected his teacher, but disagreed with him fundamentally. Plato is dear to me, he reportedly said, but truth is dearer. The problem with the forms, Aristotle argued, is that they do not explain anything. Saying the particular chairs participate in the form of chair does not tell you why chairs exist or what makes something a chair. It just pushes the question back a level. Now you have two mysteries instead of one, the particular chairs and this mysterious form hovering in some eternal realm. Worse, the forms create an unbridgeable gap between the eternal and the temporal. If the form of justice is perfect and unchanging, existing outside space and time, how does it connect to the imperfect, changing world of actual just and unjust actions? Plato never adequately explained this, and Aristotle thought he could not. Aristotle's alternative was to bring the forms down to earth. The form of a thing is not separate from the thing, it is the thing's structure, its essential nature. What makes it the kind of thing it is? The form of a chair is not floating in heavens. It is right there in the chair, the arrangement of matter that makes it suitable for sitting. This might seem like a technicality, but it changes everything. For Plato, understanding means escaping the physical world to grasp eternal abstractions. For Aristotle, Understanding means careful attention to the physical world, observing, classifying, asking why things are the way they are. Teleology. What things are for? The key to Aristotle's thinking is teleology, explanation by purpose. The Greek word telos means end or goals. A teleological explanation tells you what something is for. What is a knife for? Cutting. What is an eye for? Seeing. What is an acorn for? Becoming an oak tree. Everything has its characteristic function, and understanding that function tells you what a good version of that thing would be. A good knife cuts well, a good eye sees clearly, a good acorn grows into a healthy oak. Now comes the crucial move. What is a human being for? Aristotle's answer. Humans are for flourishing, for living well and doing well, which he calls eudaimonias, often translated as happiness, but it means something richer, not a feeling, but a kind of activity, the full exercise of human capacities in accordance with virtue over a complete life. What makes humans distinctive? We share growth with plants, perception with animals. What is unique to us is reason, the capacity to think, deliberate, choose based on understandings. So human flourishing means living in accordance with reason, exercising our rational capacities excellently. This is what we are for. This gives Aristotle his ethics. Virtues are the excellences that enable flourishing. Courage, justice, temperance, wisdom, these are not arbitrary rules imposed from outside. They are the qualities that make human life go well, given what humans are. A coward does not flourish, neither does a fool or a person with no self-control. The virtues are not constraints on a good life. They are constitutive of it. Virtue as habit. How do you become virtuous? Not by reading books or attending lectures. You become virtuous by practice, by habit, by doing virtuous actions until they become second nature. Aristotle's analogy. You become a builder by building, a harpist by playing the harps. You do not learn to play by reading about music. You learn by playing badly at first, then better with practice, until eventually it becomes natural. Virtue is the same. You become courageous by doing courageous things, just by doing just things. At first it requires effort, feels awkward. Eventually it becomes who you are. This has implications. Moral education cannot be purely intellectual. You cannot think your way to virtue. You need practice, habituation, the right upbringings, and this requires a community that shapes people well, which is why ethics leads directly to politics. It also means virtue is a settled disposition, not a one-off act. A single brave action does not make you courageous. Courage is a stable character trait, a reliable tendency to respond to danger in appropriate ways. The virtuous person does not deliberate painfully each time about whether to be honest. Honesty has become natural to them. The mean. Aristotle's famous doctrine of the mean holds that virtue lies between extremes. Courage is a mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is a mean between stinginess and wastefulness. Truthfulness lies between boastfulness and self-deprecation. This does not mean virtue is mediocrity or moderation in all things. The mean is relative to the situation and the persons. What counts as courageous depends on the danger faced, your capacities, what is at stake. A soldier and a civilian face different situations. The right amount of fear for one may be cowardice or recklessness in another. Finding the mean requires practical wisdom. Phronesis, this is perhaps Aristotle's most important concept. Practical wisdom is the ability to perceive what a situation requires and act accordingly. It cannot be reduced to rules. No set of instructions can tell you exactly how much to give to charity, when to speak up and when to stay silent, how to balance competing obligations. These require judgment, and judgment comes only from experience and good character. The practically wise person sees situations clearly and responds well. They do not follow an algorithm. They perceive the salient features of a situation, what matters, what is at stake, what the options are, and act appropriately. This is a skill, developed over time, inseparable from the virtues it guides. Man as a political animal. Now to politics, Aristotle's famous claim. Man is by nature a political animal. The Greek word is politikon, suited to life in a polis, a city-state. This is not merely saying humans are social, that we prefer company to isolation. Many animals are social. Bees and ants live in complex communities. What makes humans political is speech, logos, which enables us to communicate not just pleasure and pain, but justice and injustice, good and evil. We can deliberate together about how to live. The polis is not an artificial creation, a contract made by individuals who could exist just as well alone. It is natural to humans, the way the hive is natural to bees. A human outside political community is either a beast or a god, less than human or more than humans. We become fully human only in community with others, exercising our capacities for reason and virtue in shared life. This stands against later social contract thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, who imagined humans first existing independently and then choosing to form political associations. For Aristotle, it is back. The city is prior to the individual in the sense that individuals only become fully themselves, only flourish within a political community. You cannot learn virtue alone. You cannot exercise it alone. Human flourishing is inherently collective. The purpose of the city. If humans have a natural end, flourishing, and humans are naturally political, what is the city for? Aristotle's answer. The city exists not merely for survival, not merely for economic exchange, but for the sake of living well. A city that merely keeps its citizens alive, or merely facilitates trade, has failed in its essential purpose. The true purpose of political community is to enable human flourishing, the exercise of virtue, the living of a genuinely good life. This has radical implications. It means we can evaluate political arrangements by asking, do they make citizens better? Do they enable the exercise of virtues? A city that makes its citizens rich but vicious has failed. A city that keeps order but stunts human development has failed. The standard is not stability, not prosperity, not power. It is the quality of human lives produced. Compare this to modern assumptions. We tend to think government should be neutral about the good life. Let individuals pursue their own visions of flourishing, while the state provides security and fair rules. Aristotle would find this incoherent. The city inevitably shapes its citizens through laws, education, customs. The only question is whether it shapes them well or badly. Constitutions and their corruptions. Aristotle studied 158 constitutions. From this empirical work, he developed a classification that remains influential. Political arrangements differ along two dimensions: how many rule, and in whose interest they rule. Rule by one, by few, or by many, and rule for the common good or for private benefit. Rule by one for the common good is kingship. Rule by one for private benefit is tyranny. Rule by few for the common good is aristocracy. By few for private benefit is oligarchy. Rule by many for the common good is what Aristotle calls politeia, often translated as constitutional government or politics. Rule by many for private benefit is democracy, though he means something different from what we mean, closer to mob rule. Each good form has its characteristic corruptions. Kingship degenerates into tyranny when the monarch pursues his own interests rather than the city's. Aristocracy degenerates into oligarchy when the excellent few become merely the wealthy few, ruling for their own enrichments. Polity degenerates into democracy when the many pursue their factional interests rather than the common good. Notice that Aristotle is not straightforwardly pro-democracy. He thinks rule by the many is easily corrupted because the poor will use their numbers to redistribute wealth from the rich, which he considers unjust. His preferred arrangement, the mixed constitution, blends elements of oligarchy and democracy, giving both rich and poor a stake, balancing competing interests against each other. The importance of friendship. There is an aspect of Aristotle's ethics often neglected in summaries but central to his vision, friendships. He devotes more space to friendship than to any other topic in the Nicomachean Ethics. This is not an accident. For Aristotle, friendship. Philia, which covers more than our word suggests, including family bonds and civic fellowship, is essential to the good life. No one would choose to live without friends, even if he had all other goods. Friendship is not merely pleasant, though good friendship is pleasant. It is necessary for flourishing. Why? Because virtue requires exercise, and many virtues can only be exercised toward others. Generosity requires someone to give to. Justice requires others to deal with justly. Courage often involves defending others. The solitary individual, however personally excellent, lacks the context in which virtue becomes real. Moreover, friends serve as mirrors. We do not see ourselves clearly. A true friend, what Aristotle calls a friend in virtue, as opposed to friends of utility or pleasure, reflects back to us what we are. Through their eyes, we understand ourselves better. Through their example, we are inspired to excellence. Through their honest criticism, we correct our faults. This is why friendship is political. The city is, in a sense, an extended friendship, a community of people who wish each other well and collaborate in living good lives. A city without friendship, where citizens are merely strangers following rules, is impoverished. Shared pursuit of the good life requires bonds deeper than mere legality. The contemplative life. At the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle takes a surprising turn. Having spent the entire work discussing practical virtue, courage, justice, temperance, practical wisdom, he suddenly declares that the highest human activity is contemplation. Theoretical wisdom, Sophia, the understanding of eternal truths about the cosmos, is superior to practical wisdoms. The life of contemplation, of pure understanding, is the most divine, the happiest, the closest humans can come to the life of the gods. Philosophy, in the literal sense of love of wisdom, turns out to be the highest activity. This creates a tension in Aristotle's thoughts. Politics is essential for human flourishing. We are political animals. But the highest flourishing transcends politics. It is the solitary philosopher contemplating eternal truths. Perhaps the resolution is this: the city exists to enable the highest human activities, which include philosophical contemplations. A good city provides the security, education, and leisure that make philosophy possible. The philosopher depends on the city even while engaging in activity that transcends civic life. Or perhaps the tension cannot be fully resolved. Perhaps there is genuine conflict between the demands of political life and the demands of the philosophical life. Perhaps no human life can be entirely complete. This question, the relationship between thought and action, between the contemplative and the practical, will recur throughout our stories. Plato tried to unite them in the philosopher kings. Aristotle keeps them in tensions. Later thinkers will struggle with the same problem. Practical wisdom in politics. Here is where Aristotle's ethics and politics come together. Political life requires practical wisdom, the same phronesis needed for individual virtues. There are no perfect constitutions valid for all times and places. What works depends on circumstances, the character of the people, their history, their resources, their external threats. The good statesman perceives what a particular city needs and acts accordingly. This is why Aristotle collected 158 constitutions. He was not looking for the one right answer. He was studying the range of possibilities, the conditions under which different arrangements succeed or fail. Political knowledge is not like mathematics. It does not yield certainty or universal principles. It yields wise judgment about particular cases. This stands against Plato's approach. Plato wanted to deduce the ideal city from first principles, from the nature of justice itself, as grasped by philosophical reasons. Aristotle thought this was misguided. You cannot derive political conclusions from abstract principles alone. You need experience, observation, attention to circumstances. The best political thinker is not the purest philosopher, but the practically wise statesman who has seen much and judged well. The legacy. Plato and Aristotle set terms that still shape our thinking. From Plato, the idea that there are objective truths about justice and the good life, not merely subjective preferences, the suspicion that popular opinion is unreliable and that wisdom is rare, the vision of philosophy as transformative, not just adding information but changing how you see everything, and the troubling question of what follows if most people are wrong about the most important things. From Aristotle, the idea that humans are naturally political and flourish only in communities. That virtue is about character, formed through practice, not just following rules. That practical wisdom cannot be reduced to theories. That good political arrangements vary with circumstances, and that the purpose of political life is not merely survival or prosperity, but the living of genuinely good lives. These two visions have never been fully reconciled. Plato pulls toward the abstract, the ideal, the universals. Aristotle pulls toward the concrete, the particular, the practicals. Plato asks what justice is in itself. Aristotle asks what justice requires here and now. Plato fears the ignorance of the many. Aristotle fears the arrogance of those who think they can reason their way to certainty in practical matters. Later thinkers will draw on both. Medieval Christians will try to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with revealed religions. Modern revolutionaries will echo Plato's conviction that we should rebuild society according to rational principles. Conservatives will echo Aristotle's attention to circumstance and his suspicion of abstract theorizing. The argument continues. Quote, the Greeks did not know. Before we leave the Greeks, it is worth noting what they did not have, what assumptions they shared that later thinkers would challenge. They had no concept of individual rights in our sense. The question was not what individuals are entitled to, but what the city requires for flourishing. Freedom meant not being a slave and participating in self-governance, not a sphere of private liberty against the community. They assumed slavery. Both Plato and Aristotle took for granted that some people were naturally suited to be ruled, that the economy required unfree labor, that citizens could enjoy leisure for philosophy and politics only because others did the work. Aristotle offered arguments for natural slavery in Book 1 of the Politics, that some people lack the rational capacity for self-governance, and benefit from direction by their superiors. Whether this reflects an uncomfortable truth about human variation or a convenient justification for exploitation is a question that has never been fully settled. They thought in terms of small communities. The polis was a face-to-face society where citizens knew each other. Neither Plato nor Aristotle imagined the vast empires and nation-states that would come. Their political thought assumes a scale we have long since exceeded. They had no revelations. The gods of Greece were not moral teachers. They did not issue commandments or reveal truths about how to live. Philosophy had to work out ethics from scratch, using reason alone, without sacred texts or divine instruction. All these assumptions would be challenged. Christianity brought revelation, conscience, and a very different view of human equalities. Modernity brought individual rights, the nation-state, and the abolition of slavery. But the Greek vocabulary, virtue, justice, the good life, practical wisdom, survived these transformations. Even those who reject Greek conclusions often find themselves using Greek concepts. How to recognize Greek ideas today. Let me close with something practical. How do you recognize when Greek ideas are shaping a contemporary argument? When someone argues that character matters more than rules, that we should focus on what kind of person someone is, rather than just whether they followed procedures, that is, Aristotelians. When someone says that good judgment cannot be captured in algorithms or regulations, that experience and wisdom are irreplaceable, that is, practical wisdom in action. When someone claims there are objective truths about how to live, that some ways of life really are better than others, not just different, that is, Platonic. When someone worries that democracy gives equal voice to the wise and the foolish, that expertise should count for more than mere opinion, Plato's ghost is present. When someone argues that community is not just useful but essential to human flourishing, that isolated individuals cannot live well, that we become ourselves only through others, that is Aristotle's political animal. When someone insists we must escape conventional thinking to see things as they really are, that education is not adding information but transforming how we perceive, that is the journey out of the cave. These ideas are everywhere. Recognizing them helps you understand what is really being argued, what assumptions are in play, what an opponent might say in response. The Greeks did not have the last words, but they had many of the first words, and those words still echo. Pause and consider. Before we move on, let me leave you with a question to consider. Aristotle claimed that humans flourish only in political community, that we become fully ourselves only through participation in shared civic lives. The solitary individual is either a beast or a god. But many modern people seem to live primarily private lives. They work, consume, maintain friendships and families, pursue hobbies, but rarely engage in anything resembling Aristotle's political life. Is something missing that they might not even notice? Or was Aristotle simply wrong about human nature, projecting the values of his small-scale Athenian polis onto humanity as such? This question will return when we reach the modern thinkers. For now, hold it in mind. We have established the vocabulary, virtue, flourishing, practical wisdom, the polis, teleology. We have seen two very different approaches to philosophical inquiries. The argument is just beginning. That is enough for this lecture. Next we turn to how Christianity transformed this Greek inheritance, adding conscience, sin, grace, and a very different picture of what human beings are and what they are for. End of Module 1.